Italian nationalists called it a mutilated victory. They had been promised Fiume, Dalmatia, colonial expansion. What arrived instead was debt, inflation, and a political vacuum that would take less than a decade to fill. History does not always require a grand occasion. The Count's request changed nothing. That is precisely why it belongs on a list like this. Nguyen Tong Boon understood the colonial hierarchy's contradictions better than its architects did. The British needed to appear civilized. Civilized societies included women in their rituals. But women drinking publicly violated the decorum the empire was simultaneously performing for itself. He built a solution that dissolved the contradiction without resolving it. The empire credited itself with the hospitality. Moriando filed his patent in Turin. Turin was the wrong city. Naples understood immediately what the machine had invented. Not a faster coffee, but a new social institution. 90 seconds. A lira. Back to work. The city's version of democracy had always operated this way. Brief, cheap, non-negotiable. The municipality agreed. The price stayed fixed for most of a century. Perry's fleet changed more than trade policy. It forced an industrialization that compressed 2 centuries of European development into 40 years, and dissolved overnight the guild structures that had organized Japanese craft production since the 8th century. The shrine brewers had inherited their knowledge liturgically, tied to ceremony and season. Within a generation, what they knew was industrially irrelevant. The Volstead Act created an industry it never intended. Within a decade, the border economy had reorganized itself entirely around American thirst. The hotels, the cantinas, the taxi drivers who knew the fastest crossing. Five bartenders in 5 towns each claim to have invented it. All of them are probably right. The same problem, the same ingredients, the same solution arrived at independently. New Orleans has been governed by enough different powers to know that none of them are permanent. The city's instinct is preservation of food, of music, of the things that survived the previous administration. The old-fashioned reflects this exactly. Every era that arrived with improvements left without having made any. New Orleans treated the suggestions as the impositions they were. Krating Deng had been on Thai market stalls since the mid-1970s, a fortified tonic designed for the night shift. Chaleo Uvidya built a modest business. It was not designed for export. Matschitz understood the formula was almost beside the point. The same stimulants in a thinner liquid, in a silver can, marketed as a lifestyle rather than a utility. He was not selling energy. He was selling the idea of it. Colonial administrations have always understood that culture is transmitted through ritual, and that dismantling ritual is a form of conquest more durable than military occupation. Tax Macchiali high enough, and it disappears from daily life. What replaced it was never intended to become a national symbol. It was intended to be controllable. The colonial administration was wrong about that too. The territorial losses from the War of the Pacific were precise and permanent. The Atacama, Tarapacá, the port of Arica, still on Chilean maps. What proved harder to resolve were the cultural claims. The products both sides had produced in proximity for centuries before the war drew a line between them. Territorial disputes migrate into culture long after the military question is settled. The Pisco argument became a proxy for everything else. The Gilded Age operated on a consistent logic. Profits accumulate at the top, ingredients arrive from everywhere else, and the men at the top consume what the bottom produces without examining the connection too carefully. Rye from Pennsylvania, vermouth from Italian immigrants, bitters from a Venezuelan doctor's formula, all assembled in a room from which the people who made it were categorically excluded. The drink is accurate. Neither Martin nor Morgan set out to make a political statement. Martin had vodka Americans associated with the wrong ideology. Morgan had ginger beer with no market. A third partner had copper mugs gathering dust in a warehouse. They assembled these failures into something people would order. That it bore the name of a city the United States would spend 50 years treating as an existential threat was an irony no one planned. The mojito's origins are in an economy built on coercion. Sugar that required enslaved labor to cut and process, converted into the molasses the rum required. That chain of production ran for 3 centuries before Hemingway discovered what it tasted like. Each transition changed who profited. The workers at the beginning of the chain never did. Castro nationalized the sugar industry and inherited the same structural logic the plantations had used. No Western drinker has encountered it. More of it is consumed annually than whiskey, vodka, and gin combined, the world's best-selling spirit. Almost entirely invisible to the half of the world that didn't grow up drinking it. The Red Army drank it at Maotai because it was available, and they needed whatever was available. 3 decades later, the same liquid sat in crystal glasses in Beijing, while 2 nuclear powers negotiated the terms of a new order. The clearances were not an accident. They were a calculation that sheep were more profitable than crofting tenants, and that the tenants had no legal standing to dispute it. The evictions were conducted by law, which made them worse, not better. The stills in the glens were cultural assertions. The last institution that hadn't been seized. When the Excise Act legalized production, it was not preservation. It was taxation. The Crown was practical about these things. The Battle of the Marne was fought in September 1914 among the vines. By winter, the front had stabilized across the Appalachian, and it would remain there, shifting by kilometers, for 4 years. The harvest continued under artillery fire because the alternative was losing the vintage, and the vintage meant the revenue the war required. The caves beneath Epernay held the bottles. During the worst years, they also held the wounded, a wine region operating simultaneously as a luxury product and a military installation. Port Royal was useful to the English crown because it was deniable. The privateers held letters of marque that made their activities technically legal and practically indistinguishable from piracy. Morgan burned Portobello, looted Maracaibo, reduced Panama to rubble, and was subsequently knighted and appointed lieutenant governor of Jamaica. He spent his final years as a respectable administrator of the system his career had made profitable. 4 years after his death, the earthquake made its own assessment. Hamilton's excise was a constitutional test, whether federal authority reached west of the Alleghenies or stopped where the coinage did. Washington rode with 13,000 militia. The distillers moved to Kentucky and stayed out of reach. 126 years later, Prohibition tried again. 6 distilleries obtained medicinal licenses and kept distilling legally, while the rest of America went dry. When it ended in 1933, Bardstown had aged stock ready. 2 federal attempts, both failed. The Thujon theory gave the temperance movement what it needed, a scientific mechanism for what was, at its core, an economic argument. The phylloxera epidemic had destroyed French vineyards, reduced wine supply, and made absinthe temporarily cheaper than what the bourgeoisie preferred. The wine industry spent 20 years constructing the case that this was a public health crisis rather than a market competition they were losing. The ban arrived in 1915. The lobby won. The company's imperial project required a functional army. A functional army required protection against malaria. That required cinchona bark from Peru, processed in London, shipped to India, a supply chain crossing 3 continents to deliver a powder that kept soldiers alive long enough to enforce the occupation that made the supply chain necessary. The gin made the medicine tolerable. A century later, it was the Queen Mother's preferred drink. 4 a day, by most accounts. She lived to 101. Pemberton never saw what he had built. He sold the formula in pieces as his health declined. $2,300 in total to Asa Candler, who understood that the cocaine and the medicinal framing were both liabilities before the product could scale beyond Atlanta pharmacies. The cocaine was gone by 1903. What remained was sugar, caffeine, caramel color, and a name that survived the transition from Confederate pharmacy to global brand. The ruins of a defeated civilization produced the most recognized commercial object in human history.